where we dive deep into the darkest corners of real-life terror. Tonight, we're hitting the road with 11 of the most disturbing true horror stories from professional truck drivers who've experienced things that will make you think twice about those lonely highways. So buckle up, dim the lights, and prepare yourself for a journey into the terrifying reality of life on the road. These are the stories that truckers whisper about at truck stops. The encounters that make seasoned drivers change their routes. And the experiences that prove sometimes the most frightening things happen when you're completely alone on the open highway. My name is Josue, and I've been driving long haul for 15 years, mostly refrigerated goods across the continental United States. I've seen my share of weird things on the road: drunk drivers, wildlife, weather that'll make you question your faith. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened to me on Interstate 80 through Nebraska last March. I'm telling this story because I need people to know, especially other drivers, that there are things out there on these highways that can't be explained, things that'll follow you home if you're not careful. It was a Tuesday night, around 2 in the morning, and I was hauling a full load of frozen beef from a processing plant in Colorado to a distribution center in Chicago. The roads were clear, temperature was holding steady in my trailer, and I had my CB tuned to channel 19 like always. The stretch of I-80 through Nebraska is long and lonely, especially at that hour, with nothing but cornfields and darkness on both sides. I'd driven this route hundreds of times before, knew every mile marker, every truck stop, every place where the state troopers like to hide. It was routine, boring even, which is exactly how I preferred my runs to be. That's when I first heard the voice on the CB. It came through clear as day, no static, no interference, which was unusual because reception can be spotty in that area. The voice belonged to a man, probably middle-aged, with a slight southern accent. He was calling for help, saying his rig had broken down just ahead of my position, maybe 5 miles up the road. He gave his handle as Road Dog Willie and said he was driving a blue Kenworth with a flatbed trailer. The man sounded genuinely distressed, talking about how his engine had seized up and he was stuck on the shoulder with no cell phone signal. Now, I've always been the type to help a fellow driver in need. It's an unwritten rule of the road. We look out for each other because sometimes we're all each other's got out there. So I keyed up my mic and told Road Dog Willie that I was heading his way and would stop to see if I could help or at least call for assistance once I got to an area with better cell coverage. He thanked me, sounded relieved, and said he'd keep his hazard lights on so I could spot him. I drove the next 5 miles, keeping my eyes peeled for that blue Kenworth, but I didn't see anything. No truck, no hazard lights, nothing but empty highway. I figured maybe I'd miscalculated the distance, so I kept going. After another few miles, I called out on the CB, asking Road Dog Willie for his exact location. His voice came back immediately, still clear as a bell, saying he was just ahead, maybe 3 more miles, and apologizing for the confusion about his position. He mentioned that his truck was pulled off on a side road just past the next overpass because the shoulder wasn't safe enough on the main highway. That's when things started to get strange. I reached the overpass he mentioned, and sure enough, there was a side road, more like a dirt farming access road, really, heading off to the right. Road Dog Willie's voice came over the CB again, guiding me, telling me to take that road and that he was about a mile down it. Something felt off about the whole situation. But I'd committed to helping, and the man sounded genuinely in trouble. I slowed my rig and turned onto the dirt road, my headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. The road was rougher than I expected, full of potholes and loose gravel that made my trailer bounce and sway behind me. This wasn't the kind of road any sensible trucker would take, especially not with a full load. But Road Dog Willie kept talking on the CB, encouraging me, telling me I was almost there, that he could see my headlights coming. His voice had changed slightly, become more urgent, more insistent. He started giving me very specific directions. Turn left at the old grain silo, right at the rusted fence, straight past the abandoned farmhouse. The problem was, I was seeing all these landmarks exactly as he described them. The grain silo was there, tall and imposing against the starless sky. The rusted fence was there, its metal posts leaning at odd angles. The farmhouse was there too, its windows dark and empty, like dead eyes watching me pass. But how could he see all these things from where his truck was supposed to be? And how was his CB signal still so crystal clear when we were miles from any towers or repeaters? I'd been driving for about 20 minutes on these back roads, going deeper and deeper into farmland I'd never seen before, when I realized I had no idea how to get back to the interstate. The roads had twisted and turned so many times that I'd completely lost my bearings. My GPS had lost satellite signal miles back, showing nothing but a gray screen with "searching for signal" flashing endlessly. My cell phone showed no bars, no service whatsoever. Road Dog Willie's voice kept coming through the CB, always telling me I was close, that he was just around the next bend, over the next hill, past the next turn. But I never found him. The more I drove, the more isolated I became, and the more I began to realize that something was fundamentally wrong with this entire situation. The voice on the CB had started to sound different too, less distressed, more excited. There was an undertone to it now that made my skin crawl, like he was enjoying leading me deeper into this maze of rural roads. It was around 4 in the morning when I finally made the decision to stop. I pulled my rig over at what looked like an intersection of 2 dirt roads, both disappearing into the darkness in different directions. I had no idea where I was, no way to call for help, and a growing certainty that I was being led somewhere I didn't want to go. When I keyed up the CB to tell Road Dog Willie that I was turning around and heading back, his response chilled me to the bone. He laughed, not a friendly laugh, not a relieved laugh, but something cold and hollow that seemed to echo through the radio longer than it should have. Then he said, "You can't leave now, Josue. You're almost here. Just a little bit further." The fact that he knew my name, a name I had never given him during our entire conversation, made my blood run cold. I'd never told him my name, my handle, or anything about myself. I turned off my CB radio and sat there in the cab, engine idling, trying to figure out what to do. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the low rumble of my diesel engine and the occasional creak of my trailer settling. Then I heard it. Another truck, somewhere in the distance, its engine getting closer. My heart started pounding because I realized it might be Road Dog Willie coming to find me since I'd stopped responding to his calls. I fired up my engine and started driving, not caring which direction, just trying to get away from the sound of that approaching truck. I drove for what felt like hours, taking turns at random, hoping to find some sign of civilization, some indication of where I was. The sun was starting to rise when I finally saw something that made me nearly cry with relief. A highway sign in the distance, marking the entrance ramp back to Interstate 80. I've never been so happy to see that familiar stretch of highway in my life. I merged back onto I-80 and didn't stop driving until I reached the next truck stop, a place I'd been to dozens of times before. I sat in the parking lot for a long time, drinking coffee and trying to make sense of what had happened. I asked some of the other drivers if they'd ever heard of anyone with the handle Road Dog Willie, described the voice, the situation, everything. Most of them just shook their heads. But one older driver, a guy named Pete, who'd been running these routes for 30 years, got a strange look on his face. Pete told me about a driver named Willie Hutchins who used to run I-80 regularly back in the late 1990s. Willie drove a blue Kenworth flatbed and had the CB handle Road Dog Willie. According to Pete, Willie was known for helping stranded drivers, always ready to lend a hand or provide assistance. But Willie had died in 2019 in a jackknife accident during a snowstorm, right there on that stretch of I-80 in Nebraska. Pete said the accident happened when Willie was trying to help another driver who'd gone off the road, and that Willie's truck had rolled trying to avoid hitting a car that had stopped suddenly. I did some research when I got home, looked up old accident reports and trucking forums online. Sure enough, I found Willie Hutchins' obituary, found forum posts from drivers who remembered him, found the accident report from that night in 2019. The photos in his obituary showed exactly the truck I'd been looking for, a blue Kenworth with a flatbed trailer. And his CB handle had indeed been Road Dog Willie. I don't know what happened to me that night, and I don't pretend to understand it. Maybe Willie's spirit is still out there, still trying to help drivers in trouble, not realizing that his help might lead them into danger. Maybe something else entirely was using his voice, his identity, for reasons I don't want to think about. All I know is that I've changed my route through Nebraska. I take I-76 through Colorado now, even though it adds hours to my Chicago runs. And I've never again responded to a CB call for help from someone I can't see with my own eyes. The road has its own rules, its own mysteries, and sometimes those mysteries are better left alone. I'm Madison, and I've been driving specialized cargo for 8 years now. When I say specialized, I mean the kind of loads where you sign non-disclosure agreements, where the paperwork comes in sealed envelopes, and where you get paid 3 times your normal rate to ask absolutely no questions. I've hauled everything from prototype military equipment to pharmaceutical research materials, always following the same rule: pick it up, deliver it, and never look inside. That rule kept food on my table and a roof over my head, and it worked perfectly fine until that run from El Paso to Detroit last October. What I found in that trailer still haunts my dreams, and it's the reason I don't take no questions asked loads anymore. The call came in on a Wednesday evening while I was at a truck stop outside Phoenix. My dispatcher, Rick, had a job that needed immediate pickup, a single trailer load going from a private warehouse in El Paso to an industrial facility just outside Detroit. The pay was exceptional, nearly $8,000 for what should have been a standard 48-hour run. The only stipulation was absolute confidentiality and zero inspection of the cargo. I'd done dozens of runs like this before. So I agreed without hesitation and started driving south toward El Paso that same night. The pickup location was in an industrial district I'd never been to before, a sprawling complex of warehouses surrounded by high fences and security cameras. The facility looked legitimate enough. Clean buildings, proper signage, security guards who checked my credentials thoroughly before allowing me inside. The trailer they backed up to my cab was a standard 53-foot dry van, nothing unusual about it from the outside except for the heavy-duty locks on the rear doors and what appeared to be additional reinforcement around the door frame. The loading process was handled entirely by their crew while I waited in the office, filling out paperwork and enjoying free coffee. The facility manager, a thin man in an expensive suit who never gave me his name, emphasized repeatedly that under no circumstances should I open the trailer during transport. He explained that the cargo was extremely sensitive to environmental changes and that any breach of the sealed environment could ruin the entire shipment. I'd heard similar warnings before on pharmaceutical runs, so nothing seemed out of the ordinary. What did seem strange was how long the loading took. I'd expected to be on the road within an hour, but it was nearly midnight before they finished whatever they were doing back there. When I walked around to do my pre-trip inspection, I noticed the trailer was riding heavy, much heavier than usual, and there was a faint humming sound coming from inside, like electrical equipment running. The manager explained it was climate control equipment maintaining precise temperature and humidity levels, and again stressed the importance of never opening those doors. I left El Paso around 1 in the morning, planning to drive straight through to Detroit with only mandatory rest stops. The trailer pulled smoothly despite the heavy load, and for the first few hundred miles, everything was perfectly normal. I made good time through Texas and into New Mexico, stopping only for fuel and the required rest break. It wasn't until I reached Oklahoma that I first heard the sounds. It started as a faint scratching noise, barely audible over the road noise and my engine. At first, I assumed it was just cargo shifting slightly, maybe some loose packaging rubbing against itself. But as I continued driving, the scratching became more persistent, more rhythmic. It sounded almost like someone dragging their fingernails across the metal, over and over again. I tried turning up my radio to mask the noise, but somehow it seemed to get louder, more insistent. By the time I reached Arkansas, the scratching had been joined by other sounds, thumping noises that seemed to come in patterns, and what I could swear sounded like muffled voices. I pulled over at a rest area and walked around the trailer, pressing my ear against the side walls. The sounds were definitely coming from inside, and they definitely weren't mechanical. Whatever was making those noises was moving around in there, and it sounded distressed. I tried calling my dispatcher, but Rick's phone went straight to voicemail. I tried the emergency contact number the facility manager had given me, but it was disconnected. Standing there in that rest area parking lot at 3 in the morning, listening to what sounded increasingly like people trapped inside my trailer, I faced the hardest decision of my trucking career. I knew opening that trailer would mean forfeiting my payment and probably losing my specialized cargo certification. But I couldn't ignore what I was hearing. The sounds were getting more frantic now, more desperate, along with the scratching and thumping. I could definitely hear voices, weak, muffled, but unmistakably human. Someone was saying help over and over again. And there were other voices, speaking in what sounded like different languages. My hands were shaking as I approached the rear of the trailer with my bolt cutters, knowing that once I cut those locks, there would be no going back. The first lock came off easily enough, but the second one was heavier, more sophisticated. As I worked on it, the sounds from inside became almost frantic. Whatever was in there knew I was trying to get the doors open. When the second lock finally gave way, I hesitated for a moment, listening to the desperate sounds from inside, before finally grabbing the door handle and pulling it open. The smell hit me first, a combination of human waste, fear sweat, and something else I couldn't identify. The trailer was dimly lit by battery-powered LED strips running along the ceiling, and what I saw made my stomach turn. The cargo wasn't goods or equipment, it was people. Dozens of them, maybe 40 or 50, crammed into a space barely large enough for half that number. They were sitting on the floor, chained together at the ankles, looking up at me with expressions of hope mixed with terror. Most of them appeared to be young women, though there were some men and what looked like teenagers. Their clothes were dirty and torn, their faces gaunt from hunger and dehydration. Some of them were unconscious or barely conscious, slumped against the walls of the trailer. Others reached toward me desperately, speaking in languages I didn't understand, but with voices that clearly begged for help. The reality of what I was looking at hit me like a physical blow. I had been unknowingly transporting human trafficking victims across state lines. I immediately called 911, my voice shaking as I tried to explain the situation to the dispatcher. While I waited for law enforcement to arrive, I did what I could to help the people in the trailer. I gave them water from my truck, tried to reassure them that help was coming, used my phone to translate basic phrases into Spanish and what I thought might be Ukrainian or Romanian. Several of the women grabbed my hands and wouldn't let go, tears streaming down their faces as they realized they might finally be safe. The FBI arrived along with local law enforcement, paramedics, and what seemed like half the emergency services in Arkansas. The scene that followed was controlled chaos as they worked to free the victims from their chains and get medical attention for those who needed it most urgently. I learned later that several of the people had been in that trailer for over a week, surviving on minimal food and water while being transported like cargo across the country. The investigation that followed revealed a sophisticated human trafficking operation that had been using legitimate-looking logistics companies to transport victims. The warehouse in El Paso was raided the same night, leading to multiple arrests and the discovery of other victims being held there. The facility in Detroit was a front for a labor trafficking operation, where the victims would have been forced to work in illegal factories and brothels throughout the Midwest. I spent the next several weeks cooperating with federal investigators, providing testimony and evidence about my role in the operation. The FBI assured me that I wouldn't face charges since I had no knowledge of the true nature of my cargo and had taken immediate action to help the victims once I discovered them. But the legal clearance didn't help with the guilt I felt knowing that I had unknowingly been part of something so horrific. The nightmares started almost immediately. I would dream about those faces looking up at me from the trailer floor, about the sounds of desperate scratching and muffled pleas for help. I kept thinking about all the other specialized loads I'd hauled over the years, wondering how many of them might have involved similar cargo that I had never bothered to check. The thought that I might have unknowingly transported other victims without ever knowing it made me physically sick. I testified in court when the case went to trial 8 months later. Seeing the survivors again, healthier now but still bearing the emotional scars of their ordeal, reinforced my decision to completely change how I operated as a driver. I no longer take any loads where I can't verify exactly what I'm hauling. I ask questions, I demand to see the cargo being loaded, and I trust my instincts when something doesn't feel right. The trucking industry depends on trust and efficiency, and most of the time, that works fine. But there are people out there who exploit that trust, who count on drivers following the rules and not asking questions. What happened in Arkansas taught me that sometimes the most important thing you can do as a driver is break the rules and ask those questions, even when it costs you money or puts your career at risk. Those people in my trailer were someone's daughters, sons, sisters, brothers. They deserved better than being treated as cargo, and I'm grateful that I found the courage to open those doors when I did. My name is Aries, and I've been an owner-operator for 22 years, specializing in hauling heavy construction equipment across the western states. When you've been driving as long as I have, you develop a sixth sense about people and situations that aren't right. You learn to spot the lot lizards, the thieves looking to steal cargo or fuel, the con artists trying to run insurance scams. But nothing in my 2 decades on the road prepared me for what happened during a run from Salt Lake City to Denver last September, when I picked up a stalker who turned my routine delivery into a nightmare that lasted over 800 miles. I was hauling a massive excavator on a lowboy trailer, the kind of load that requires permits and careful route planning because of bridge clearances and weight restrictions. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I stopped at a Flying J truck stop outside Rock Springs, Wyoming, for fuel and a mandatory rest break. The place was typical for that area. Busy but not crowded, mostly long-haul drivers heading east or west on I-80. I'd been to this particular stop dozens of times before and knew the layout well. Always parked in the same section where I could keep an eye on my expensive cargo. As I was fueling up, I noticed a man sitting in a beat-up sedan parked near the edge of the truck lot. He wasn't doing anything particularly suspicious, just sitting there, maybe waiting for someone. But something about him caught my attention. He was maybe 50 years old, thin, wearing a dirty baseball cap and clothes that looked like he'd been sleeping in them. What made me notice him was the way he was watching me. Not casually like someone might glance at an interesting piece of equipment, but intently, like he was studying me. I finished fueling and went inside to grab some food and use the restroom. When I came back out 20 minutes later, the man was still there, still watching. Our eyes met for a moment across the parking lot. And instead of looking away like most people would, he just stared back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't hostile exactly, but it wasn't friendly either. It was the kind of look that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I did my pre-trip inspection and got back on the road, putting the strange encounter out of my mind. I had a schedule to keep and over 400 miles still to cover. My route took me south on Highway 191 toward I-70, then east through Colorado toward Denver. It's mostly rural highway through that stretch, with small towns spaced far apart and plenty of empty country in between. I was making good time, keeping my speed down because of the heavy load, when I spotted the sedan in my mirrors. At first, I didn't think much of it. Lots of cars travel the same routes as trucks, and it's not unusual to see the same vehicle for miles at a time on these long stretches of highway. But this car was maintaining a very specific distance behind me, maybe a quarter mile back, never getting closer, never falling farther behind. When I slowed down for construction zones or steep grades, the sedan slowed down too. When traffic cleared and I could pick up speed, so did the car. I tested my suspicions by pulling off at a rest area near Vernal, Utah. I parked my rig and walked around to check my load securement, keeping an eye on the highway. Sure enough, the sedan drove past the rest area, slowed down like the driver was thinking about stopping, then continued on. But instead of disappearing down the road like a normal traveler would, the car pulled off at the next exit about 2 miles ahead, turned around, and came back, parking at a gas station where the driver could see the rest area. That's when I knew for certain I was being followed. I'd never seen this man before in my life, had no idea why anyone would want to track my movements. But there was no mistaking the pattern. I got back in my truck and continued toward I-70, and sure enough, the sedan fell in behind me again, maintaining that same careful distance. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, that maybe the guy was just a slow driver who happened to be going the same direction, but my instincts were screaming that something was wrong. The real proof came when I had to take a detour around road construction near Grand Junction, Colorado. The detour was well marked, but took trucks on a different route than regular traffic, adding about 30 miles to the trip through some pretty remote country roads. I figured this would be where my imaginary tail would disappear, since there was no way he could know about the truck-specific detour route, unless he was specifically following me. But there he was, still maintaining that quarter-mile distance behind me on roads that barely saw any traffic at all. Now I was genuinely scared. This wasn't random. Someone was deliberately tracking me, and I had no idea why. I tried calling the police, but I was in an area with spotty cell coverage. And besides, what was I going to tell them? That someone was driving on the same public roads I was. Technically, the man wasn't breaking any laws, even though every instinct I had was telling me I was in danger. I decided to put some distance between us by pushing a little harder than I normally would with a heavy load. My truck has enough power to outrun most cars when I need to, even with 80,000 pounds on the trailer. I started pulling away from the sedan, opening up a gap of several miles over the next hour. I thought maybe I'd lost him, maybe he'd given up whatever game he was playing. But when I crested a hill outside Rifle, Colorado, there he was again, somehow having closed the distance without me seeing how. That's when I realized he wasn't just following me, he was anticipating my route. Somehow, this stranger knew where I was going better than I did. He was taking shortcuts, maybe using back roads I didn't know about, to stay ahead of me and then fall in behind again. The implications of that terrified me. It meant he'd been planning this, studying my route, maybe watching me for longer than I'd realized. I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of continuing toward Denver on my planned route, I took an exit that led to a Colorado State Patrol way station that I knew operated 24 hours. If this guy was really following me, I'd find out for sure. And I'd have law enforcement nearby when I did. The way station was about 10 miles off the main highway, down a road that had no other destinations. Sure enough, the sedan took the same exit. Now there was no question. I was definitely being stalked. I pulled into the way station and immediately asked to speak with a trooper, explaining the situation as calmly as I could. The officer on duty, Sergeant Martinez, took my concerns seriously and agreed to help. We watched from the way station office as the sedan drove slowly past the entrance, the driver clearly trying to see where I'd gone. Sergeant Martinez ran the license plate and discovered the car had been reported stolen 3 days earlier from a hotel parking lot in Salt Lake City. That information changed everything. Now we were dealing with a potential felon, not just someone with poor social boundaries. The sergeant called for backup and set up what he described as a controlled contact with the suspect. When the backup units arrived, they positioned themselves strategically around the area while I continued on toward Denver, with one patrol car following me discreetly. The plan was to let the stolen car follow me out of the way station, then stop the driver once we had him on a road where he couldn't easily escape. It worked perfectly. The sedan fell in behind me again as soon as I left the way station, apparently not noticing the unmarked patrol car that joined our little convoy. The arrest happened about 5 miles down the road. The patrol cars boxed in the sedan at a traffic light, and the driver was taken into custody without incident. I never learned his full name. But Sergeant Martinez told me later that the man had a history of stalking and had been released from prison just 6 months earlier. Apparently, he developed an obsession with truck drivers after spending time in a facility near a major truck route. And he'd been following different drivers for weeks at a time, studying their patterns and routes. The investigation revealed that he'd been living in that stolen car, following truckers across multiple states, apparently building up to something more serious than just surveillance. They found notebooks in the car with detailed information about at least a dozen different drivers, including their routes, schedules, and personal information he'd somehow gathered. My information was in there too, along with photos of my truck and notes about my regular stops. The scariest part was learning that I wasn't his first target. 2 other drivers had reported similar stalking incidents over the previous months. But without concrete evidence, the reports hadn't been connected. One driver in Nevada had actually been approached by the same man at a remote truck stop, where the stalker had tried to engage him in conversation about his cargo and schedule. That driver had the good sense to leave immediately and report the incident. but the man had disappeared before police could respond. I testified at his trial 8 months later, where I learned that he'd been planning to rob trucks carrying valuable cargo, using his surveillance to identify targets and plan ambushes at remote locations. The excavator I'd been hauling was worth over $200,000, making it exactly the kind of target he was looking for. If I hadn't gone to that way station when I did, I might have ended up stopped on some lonely stretch of highway, facing an armed robbery or worse. The experience changed how I operate as a driver. I'm much more aware of my surroundings now, much quicker to notice when something doesn't feel right. I vary my routes when possible, even if it costs me time and fuel. And I always trust my instincts when they tell me someone or something is wrong. The road is dangerous enough without having to worry about predators specifically targeting truck drivers, but they're out there, and we need to watch out for each other. My name is Hendricks, and I've been running dry van loads across the country for 12 years. In all that time, I've had a strict policy about hitchhikers. I don't pick them up ever. It's a liability issue, a safety concern, and frankly, most of the people you see on the side of the road looking for rides are trouble waiting to happen. But sometimes your conscience gets the better of your common sense. And that's exactly what happened to me on Highway 50 in Nevada last June. What started as a simple act of kindness turned into the most terrifying experience of my life. One that still has me checking my mirrors obsessively and questioning everything I thought I knew about reality. I was heading east from Reno to Salt Lake City with a load of electronics, running ahead of schedule for once and feeling pretty good about the world. Highway 50 through Nevada is known as the loneliest road in America, and the nickname fits perfectly. It's nearly 300 miles of mostly empty desert, with small towns scattered so far apart that you better have plenty of fuel and water if you break down. I'd driven this route hundreds of times and always respected it for what it is. Beautiful, desolate, and completely unforgiving if something goes wrong. It was around 9 in the evening, still light because of the summer sun, when I saw her standing beside the road about 50 miles east of Fallon. She was a woman, maybe 30 years old, wearing a simple blue dress that looked oddly formal for someone stranded in the middle of nowhere. She wasn't frantically waving for help like most hitchhikers do. Instead, she was just standing there calmly, as if she was waiting for a bus that everyone knew wasn't coming. Something about her posture, her stillness, made me slow down despite my better judgment. As I got closer, I could see that she was attractive in a timeless sort of way, with dark hair pulled back and an expression that seemed both sad and hopeful. She made eye contact with me through my windshield and raised her hand in a gentle wave, not demanding or desperate, just acknowledging my presence. Against every rule I'd set for myself, I found myself pulling over about 100 yards past where she was standing. I climbed down from my cab and walked back to where she waited. Up close, she was even more striking, with pale skin and dark eyes that seemed much older than her apparent age. She thanked me for stopping in a voice that was soft but clear, with no particular accent I could identify. When I asked where she was headed, she simply said east. And when I asked where she'd come from, she said she'd been walking for a very long time. Her answers were vague, but something about her demeanor made me not want to press for details. She climbed into the passenger seat of my cab with the fluid grace of someone who'd done it many times before, settling in without any of the awkwardness most people show when they're not used to being in a big truck. As we started rolling again, she sat quietly, looking out the window at the desert landscape passing by. I tried making conversation, asking the usual questions. What's your name? What do you do? Family waiting for you? But her responses were always minimal and somehow unsatisfying. Her name was Sarah, she said, and she was traveling to see family. When I asked what kind of work she did, she said she helped people who were lost. When I asked about her family, she said they'd been waiting for her for a long time. Everything she said was technically an answer to my questions, but somehow told me nothing at all about who she was or what her situation really was. What started to unnerve me was how much she seemed to know about me without my telling her anything. She mentioned that I'd been divorced 2 years ago, which was true, but not something I'd brought up. She asked how my daughter Emma was doing in college, using my daughter's name even though I'd never mentioned having a child. When I asked how she could possibly know these things, she just smiled sadly and said that people carry their stories with them whether they realize it or not. We'd been driving for about an hour when the first really strange thing happened. I was telling her about a delivery I'd made the previous week to a warehouse in Phoenix, describing the loading dock and the difficult backing situation I'd had to navigate. Sarah nodded knowingly and said, "Yes, that was the blue building with the broken security light on the north side." The problem was, she was absolutely right about details I hadn't mentioned, details she couldn't have known unless she'd been there herself. I started paying closer attention to our conversation after that, and I realized she was doing this constantly, filling in details about my life, my roots, my experiences that I'd never shared with her. She knew that I always stopped at a particular truck stop in Elko, knew that I preferred to fuel on the right side of the island because the pumps worked faster, knew that I'd had transmission problems with this same truck 8 months ago in Colorado. It was like she'd been following my life from a distance, taking notes. The sun was setting by the time we reached Austin, Nevada, a tiny town that barely qualifies as a wide spot in the road. I told Sarah I needed to stop for fuel and asked if she wanted anything from the convenience store. She declined, but said she'd wait in the truck. I filled up and went inside to pay, and when I mentioned to the clerk that I had a passenger, he gave me a strange look. "Haven't seen you with anyone," he said. "You've been alone every time you've stopped here." I went back to the truck, thinking the clerk was mistaken or maybe just hadn't noticed Sarah when we'd pulled in. But when I climbed back into the cab, something felt different. Sarah was sitting exactly where she'd been before, in exactly the same position, but somehow the atmosphere in the cab had changed. It felt colder, more oppressive, like the air itself had become heavier. As we continued east, Sarah's conversation became increasingly personal and increasingly impossible. She started mentioning things from my childhood, names of friends I'd had in elementary school, details about my first job that I'd never told anyone. She described the apartment where I'd lived when I first started trucking, down to the color of the carpet and the way the kitchen faucet dripped. She knew about arguments I'd had with my ex-wife, knew about money problems I'd never discussed with anyone, knew about decisions I'd made that I regretted but had never spoken aloud. The most disturbing part was how matter-of-fact she was about all of this knowledge. She wasn't showing off or trying to impress me. She was just talking about my life as if she'd lived it alongside me. When I finally asked her directly how she could know all these things, she turned to look at me with those dark eyes and said, "We've traveled together many times before, Hendrix. You just don't remember." That statement sent chills down my spine because it felt true in a way I couldn't explain. There was something familiar about her, something that went beyond our brief acquaintance. But I was absolutely certain I'd never seen her before that evening on Highway 50. I would have remembered someone like Sarah, someone who radiated that strange combination of beauty and sadness, someone whose presence seemed to change the very air around her. I decided to test whether she was really there at all. At the next town, Eureka, I pulled into a well-lit gas station and told Sarah I needed to check my load securement. I walked around to the back of the trailer, then circled back to the driver's side of the cab, looking through the windshield to see if I could see her from the outside. The passenger seat appeared empty. I couldn't see her at all, even though I knew she was sitting right there. When I climbed back into the cab, she was exactly where I'd left her, smiling that sad smile and asking if everything was secure. I asked her to get out of the truck with me, to come inside the convenience store. But she said she preferred to wait. Every time I suggested she leave the cab, she had a reason to stay put. It was like she couldn't or wouldn't exist outside of my truck. The final test came when we reached the Utah border. There's a weigh station there that's always open, and I told Sarah I needed to stop for a routine inspection. As I pulled into the weigh station, she said something that made my blood run cold. "You won't be able to introduce me to the officer. He won't be able to see me. But don't worry. I'll still be here when you're done." Sure enough, when I went through the inspection process, the officer saw only me. He asked if I was traveling alone, and when I said I had a passenger, he looked confused and asked me to show him where. I opened the passenger door, pointed to where Sarah was sitting, but the officer saw nothing. He looked at me with concern and asked if I was feeling all right, if I needed medical attention. I completed the inspection and got back on the road, Sarah still sitting beside me as if nothing had happened. She seemed sadder now, more distant, and she began talking about how lonely the road could be, how drivers sometimes needed company even when they thought they preferred solitude. She said she tried to help people who spent too much time alone, people who were starting to lose track of what was real and what wasn't. As we approached Salt Lake City, Sarah told me it was time for her to go. She said she'd enjoyed our conversation and hoped she'd been good company. I asked her where I should drop her off, but she said that wouldn't be necessary. She reached over and touched my hand. Her skin was ice cold, and said, "Thank you for picking me up, Hendricks. Not everyone would have stopped." I blinked, and she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, as if she'd never been there at all. There was no trace of her presence, except for a faint scent that might have been perfume or might have been desert flowers. I pulled over immediately and searched every inch of my truck, but there was no sign that anyone else had ever been inside. I've never told this story to anyone before now because I know how it sounds. I know what people would think, what conclusions they'd draw about a driver who claims to have picked up a hitchhiker who wasn't really there. But I also know what I experienced. And I know that Sarah, whatever she was, knew things about me that no living person could have known. Maybe she was a hallucination brought on by too many hours alone on the road. Maybe she was something else entirely. All I know for certain is that I've never felt more unsettled in my life, and I've never been more grateful to reach my destination. I still drive Highway 50 sometimes, but I never stop for hitchhikers anymore. And sometimes, when I'm feeling particularly lonely on those long desert stretches, I catch myself looking in the passenger seat, half expecting to see Sarah sitting there with that sad smile, ready to keep me company whether I want it or not. My name is Bryce, and I've been hauling hazmat loads for 19 years, with the last 12 of those specialized in transporting compressed gases and flammable liquids. When you're certified to haul the kind of cargo that can level a city block if something goes wrong, you develop an obsessive attention to detail about safety procedures and equipment maintenance. Every morning before I roll, I do a thorough pre-trip inspection that takes 45 minutes minimum. I check every airline, every brake component, every safety system twice. That routine has kept me alive and kept other people safe for nearly 2 decades. Which is why what happened to me in the Colorado Rockies last November was so terrifying. Because someone had deliberately sabotaged my truck, and they'd done it so expertly that I almost didn't catch it in time. I was running a load of liquid propane from a distribution facility outside Denver to a heating supply company in Grand Junction, about 240 miles through some of the most challenging mountain terrain in the country. The load was worth more than $80,000. But the real concern wasn't the money. It was the 7,000 gallons of pressurized flammable gas I was hauling through mountain passes, where a serious accident could close the interstate for days and potentially kill dozens of people. This wasn't the kind of cargo you took lightly. And I'd been making this specific run monthly for the past 3 years without any problems. The trouble started before I even left Denver. I'd stayed overnight at a truck stop on the outskirts of the city, parked in a well-lit area where I could keep an eye on my rig. When I came out for my morning pre-trip inspection, I immediately noticed that someone had been around my truck during the night. There were footprints in the light snow around my trailer that weren't mine, and one of my airline covers was slightly askew. It could have been innocent. Maybe another driver had admired my rig, or a lot attendant had walked around checking for problems. But something about it felt wrong. I spent extra time on my brake inspection that morning, checking every connection, every line, every component I could see. Everything looked normal, all my air pressure readings were correct, and my brakes tested fine during my initial equipment check. I chalked up my uneasiness to paranoia and got on the road, heading west toward the mountains with a full load of propane and a growing sense that something wasn't right. The first sign of real trouble came about 60 miles outside Denver. As I was climbing toward the Eisenhower Tunnel, my air pressure gauge started fluctuating slightly. Nothing dramatic, just small variations that shouldn't have been happening with a properly functioning system. I pulled over at the next available spot and did another brake check, but everything still seemed fine. The lines looked secure, the connections were tight, and I wasn't hearing any unusual sounds that would indicate an air leak. But as I continued climbing toward the tunnel, the pressure fluctuations got worse. By the time I reached the tunnel entrance at over 11,000 feet elevation, my primary air tank was losing pressure faster than my compressor could replace it. I knew I was in serious trouble when I realized that someone had sabotaged my air brake system in a way that wouldn't show up during a normal inspection. They'd created a slow leak that would only manifest under the stress of mountain driving, when I needed my brakes the most. The Eisenhower Tunnel is 1.7 miles long and runs through the Continental Divide, and under normal circumstances, it's just another part of the drive. But with failing brakes and a full load of propane, that tunnel became a potential death trap. I radioed ahead to the tunnel operators, explaining my situation and requesting priority passage. But they informed me that there was construction inside the tunnel that would require me to maintain a steady speed rather than coasting through. Maintaining steady speed with failing brakes and 80,000 pounds of explosive cargo is every hazmat driver's nightmare. I had to use my engine brake and transmission to control my speed, saving what little air pressure I had left for emergencies. The tunnel seemed to stretch forever, and every few hundred yards I could feel my remaining brake pressure dropping. By the time I emerged on the western side, I was running on fumes and panic. The descent from the tunnel toward Vail is a long, steep grade that's challenging even with perfect brakes. With my compromised system, it was potentially suicidal. I radioed for help, explaining my situation to anyone listening on the CB, and got advice from other drivers about escape ramps and emergency procedures. But what really scared me was the realization that this wasn't an accident or equipment failure. Someone had deliberately sabotaged my truck, timing the brake failure to occur in the most dangerous possible location. That's when I noticed the car that had been following me since Denver. It was a dark sedan, maybe 10 years old, staying about a quarter mile behind me regardless of how my speed varied. At first, I'd assumed it was just another traveler heading west, but now I realized it had been maintaining that exact distance for over 100 miles. Even more disturbing, the car had somehow stayed with me through the tunnel despite the construction delays and my variable speed, which meant the driver knew exactly what was happening to my truck. I managed to nurse my failing brakes down the mountain by using every technique I'd learned in 19 years of driving. I rode my engine brake hard, downshifted at every opportunity, and used the truck's momentum and gravity to control my speed rather than relying on my air brakes. It was terrifying, exhausting work, especially knowing that one mistake could turn my rig into a massive fireball that would take out everything within a half-mile radius. The sedan stayed with me the entire time, maintaining that consistent distance even as I struggled to control my speed on the mountain grades. Whoever was driving that car knew exactly what was happening to my truck and was following me for reasons I didn't want to think about. The possibilities that ran through my mind were all bad. Maybe they were waiting for me to crash so they could steal my cargo. Maybe they were planning to cause an accident for insurance fraud. Or maybe something even worse. I finally made it to the bottom of the mountain and limped into a truck stop in Vail. My air pressure so low that I barely had enough braking power left to stop safely. I immediately called 911 and reported both the sabotage and the car that had been following me. While I waited for law enforcement to arrive, I got under my truck to inspect the brake system more thoroughly, and what I found made my blood run cold. Someone had made tiny holes in two of my air lines, so small they were almost invisible, sealed with a substance that would dissolve slowly under the heat and pressure of mountain driving. It was sophisticated sabotage, the kind that required detailed knowledge of air brake systems and careful planning. This wasn't random vandalism or opportunistic theft. Someone had specifically targeted me and my cargo, and they'd tried to cause a brake failure in the most dangerous possible location. The Colorado State Patrol arrived within 20 minutes, along with a hazmat specialist and a bomb squad technician who examined my cargo for signs of tampering. While they worked, I described the sedan that had been following me. But when we looked around the truck stop, it was nowhere to be found. The officers took my statements seriously, especially when their mechanic confirmed that my brake lines had been deliberately sabotaged. The investigation that followed revealed that I'd been targeted as part of a sophisticated cargo theft operation. The thieves had been monitoring hazmat shipments, identifying high-value loads like mine, and planning elaborate schemes to steal the cargo. Their method was to sabotage trucks in ways that would cause breakdowns or accidents in remote locations, then pose as good Samaritans offering help while actually stealing whatever they could. What made this case particularly disturbing was how much planning had gone into it. The investigators found evidence that the thieves had been watching the Denver facility for weeks, learning the schedules and routes of regular drivers. They'd identified me as a target because of my monthly propane runs and had been planning the sabotage for over a month. The brake line sabotage was designed to cause a breakdown just past Vail, in a remote area where they could approach my disabled truck without witnesses. The sedan that had been following me was found abandoned in a parking lot in Grand Junction, stolen plates and wiped clean of fingerprints. But the FBI was able to connect it to similar incidents in Wyoming and Utah, where other hazmat drivers had experienced suspicious equipment failures in remote locations. In at least 2 cases, drivers had been approached by helpful strangers who'd offered assistance while actually casing their cargo for later theft. I was incredibly lucky that I'd caught the sabotage early enough to maintain some control over my truck. The investigators told me that if I'd lost my brakes completely on that mountain descent, the resulting explosion would have been visible from 50 miles away and probably would have closed I-70 for weeks. The fact that someone was willing to risk that kind of catastrophe just to steal propane showed how little regard they had for human life. The experience changed everything about how I operate as a hazmat driver. I now do my pre-trip inspections at secure facilities rather than public truck stops whenever possible. I vary my routes and schedules to avoid establishing predictable patterns. I'm much more aware of vehicles that seem to be following me, and I report anything suspicious immediately rather than assuming it's coincidence. Most importantly, I now understand that hauling hazmat isn't just about following safety procedures and maintaining equipment. It's about recognizing that my cargo makes me a target for people who see massive destruction as an acceptable risk if it helps them make money. The responsibility of hauling dangerous materials extends beyond just preventing accidents. It includes protecting that cargo from people who would deliberately cause disasters for their own benefit. Every time I drive through those Colorado mountains now, I remember how close I came to becoming part of a catastrophe that would have made national news. The brake pedal under my foot isn't just a piece of equipment anymore. It's the thin line between professional transportation and mass destruction. And I never forget that someone out there tried to cross that line with my truck and my life. My name is Valentina, and I've been team driving with my husband Carlos for 6 years, running long-haul routes across the country in our Freightliner Cascadia. We were one of those couples who did everything together, lived together, worked together, shared every mile of road and every sunrise from behind the windshield. When Carlos died suddenly of a heart attack at a truck stop in Oklahoma 3 months ago, I thought my driving days were over. But after the funeral, after the grief counseling, after weeks of sitting alone in our house staring at the walls, I decided I needed to get back on the road. I needed to prove to myself that I could still do the job we'd done together for so long. That decision led me to the most inexplicable and terrifying experience of my life. At a rest area in Kentucky that I'm now convinced doesn't actually exist. It was my first solo run since Carlos's death, a relatively easy load of furniture from North Carolina to Illinois. I'd specifically chosen a route and schedule that we'd never run together, wanting to avoid the painful memories that would come with familiar truck stops and roads. I was taking I-75 north through Kentucky, a route I'd only traveled a handful of times, when exhaustion and grief finally caught up with me somewhere south of Lexington. I'd been driving for 11 hours straight, which was legal but not smart, especially given my emotional state. The grief would hit me in waves. One minute I'd be fine, focused on the road and the job, and the next minute I'd be crying so hard I could barely see through the windshield. I knew I needed to stop for the night, but all the truck stops I passed were either full or looked too much like places Carlos and I had stayed together. I kept pushing forward, telling myself I'd find somewhere suitable just a few more miles down the road. It was nearly midnight when I saw the rest area sign. It was well lit and professional looking, exactly like the standard Kentucky DOT signs you see throughout the state, indicating a full-service rest area with truck parking, restrooms, and food service. What caught my attention was that it advertised amenities I'd never seen at a highway rest area: showers, truck repair service, and a 24-hour restaurant. It sounded too good to be true, but I was exhausted enough that I didn't question my good fortune. The exit ramp was clearly marked and well-maintained, leading to a facility that was much larger and more elaborate than any rest area I'd ever seen. The parking lot was enormous, easily big enough for 100 trucks, with separate areas for cars and RVs. The buildings were modern and attractive, with warm lighting that made the whole place feel welcoming and safe. There were maybe 30 other trucks already parked there, which seemed about right for a facility this size on a major interstate. I found a parking spot near the main building and shut down my engine, feeling relief wash over me as I realized I'd found exactly what I needed. The building was clearly marked as a travel center, with signs indicating restrooms, showers, a restaurant, and even a small convenience store. Everything looked legitimate and professional, much nicer than most of the commercial truck stops I was used to. Inside, the facility was even more impressive. The lobby was spacious and clean, with comfortable seating areas and a check-in desk that looked like something you'd find at a mid-range hotel. The woman behind the counter was friendly and professional, offering me a shower room and explaining that the restaurant served meals until 2 a.m. She seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being, asking if I was traveling alone and whether I needed anything special to help me rest comfortably. The shower facilities were immaculate, better than anything I'd encountered at commercial truck stops. The water was hot, the towels were fresh, and there were complimentary toiletries that actually smelled pleasant. After weeks of stress and grief, that shower felt like a small miracle. I took my time, letting the hot water wash away some of the tension I'd been carrying, feeling more human than I had since Carlos's funeral. The restaurant was equally impressive, with a varied menu and food that was surprisingly good for a highway facility. The waitress was attentive and kind, and when she noticed that I seemed upset, she sat with me for a few minutes and listened while I told her about Carlos and how difficult this first solo trip was for me. Her compassion felt genuine, and for the first time in months, I felt like someone truly understood what I was going through. I spent about 3 hours at the rest area, eating, resting, and trying to gather the emotional strength to continue my journey. The other drivers I encountered were friendly and supportive, and several of them made a point of checking on me when they realized I was traveling alone for the first time. It felt like a community of people who understood the challenges of life on the road, and their kindness helped ease some of the loneliness I'd been feeling. When I was ready to leave, I thanked the staff for their hospitality and asked for directions back to I-75. The woman at the desk gave me clear instructions. Exit the parking lot, turn right, and follow the road for about 2 miles back to the interstate on-ramp. I felt refreshed and emotionally centered as I started my truck and prepared to continue my journey to Illinois. But when I followed her directions, I couldn't find the interstate. The road led through rural Kentucky countryside, past farms and small houses. But there were no signs indicating I-75 or any other major highway. I drove for 10 miles, then 20, becoming increasingly confused and concerned. My GPS showed me in a gray area with no roads marked, displaying the searching for signal message I'd only seen in the most remote locations. I turned around and headed back toward the rest area, thinking I'd misunderstood the directions or taken a wrong turn somewhere. But when I reached the area where the rest area should have been, there was nothing there. No buildings, no parking lot, no signs, just an empty field beside a country road that didn't look like it had ever had any kind of development on it. I stopped and got out of my truck, walking around the area where I was certain the rest area had been just an hour earlier. There was no evidence that any buildings had ever existed there. No foundation remnants, no utility connections, no access roads. The ground was undisturbed grassland that looked like it had been growing wild for decades. Even more disturbing, there was no exit ramp from any highway, no road that could have led me to this location from I-75. I spent the next several hours driving around the rural roads of that area, trying to find some explanation for what had happened to me. I looked for I-75, for the rest area, for any landmark that would help me understand where I was or how I'd gotten there. My GPS remained useless, showing me in an unmapped area that apparently didn't exist in any database. wasn't until dawn that I finally found a real highway, a state route that led me to a genuine truck stop where I could get my bearings. The clerk there looked at me strangely when I described the rest area I'd been to, telling me there was no such facility anywhere in that part of Kentucky. He showed me a state map that clearly indicated all the rest areas along I-75, and none of them matched what I'd experienced. I called the Kentucky Department of Transportation from that truck stop, describing the facility and asking for information about it. The person I spoke with was polite but confused, telling me that there was no rest area matching my description anywhere along I-75 in Kentucky. They had detailed records of every facility in the state, and what I was describing simply didn't exist. The most unsettling part of the whole experience was how real it had felt. I had clear memories of every detail: the taste of the food, the feeling of the hot shower, the conversations I'd had with the staff and other drivers. I had taken money out of my wallet to pay for my meal, and that money was gone. I had used toiletries from the shower facility, and they had left a distinctive scent that I could still detect on my skin and hair. But according to everyone I spoke with, none of it could have happened. There was no facility where I claimed to have been, no exit ramp leading to it, no infrastructure that could have supported such a place. The logical conclusion was that I'd had some kind of breakdown, that grief and exhaustion had caused me to hallucinate or lose time in some way that I couldn't understand. I completed my delivery to Illinois and drove straight home, telling no one about what had happened. I researched the area extensively online, looking for any mention of a rest area that might have been closed or demolished, but found nothing. I even considered driving back to Kentucky to investigate further. But the thought of trying to find a place that apparently didn't exist terrified me more than I was willing to admit. The experience forced me to question everything about that night. My memory, my mental state, my grip on reality itself. But it also gave me something I hadn't expected: a sense of peace about Carlos's death and my ability to continue driving without him. Whatever had happened at that rest area, real or imagined, had provided exactly what I needed at exactly the moment I needed it most. I'm still driving solo now, 6 months later, and I've never encountered anything like that rest area again. But sometimes, when I'm exhausted and grieving and feeling completely alone on the road, I find myself looking for exits that might lead to places that offer exactly what a driver needs, whether they exist in the real world or not. The road has its own way of taking care of the people who travel it, even when that care comes in forms that can't be explained or understood. I may never know what really happened that night in Kentucky, but I know that I left that place feeling stronger and more capable than I had since Carlos died. Sometimes that's enough, whether the help comes from a real place or from something else entirely. My name is Maximiliano, and I've been hauling oversized loads on flatbed trailers for 25 years. When you specialize in moving industrial equipment, power plant components, and military hardware, you develop a very precise understanding of weight distribution, load securement, and cargo behavior. I can tell you within a few hundred pounds how heavy something is just by how it affects my truck's handling. And I can spot a shifting load from the smallest change in how my trailer tracks behind me. That expertise is what made my experience hauling a mysterious container from Nevada to Pennsylvania so deeply disturbing. Because according to everything I know about physics and cargo handling, what I witnessed should have been impossible. The job came through a broker I'd worked with before, a guy named Peterson who specialized in government surplus and classified cargo. The pay was exceptional, $15,000 for what should have been a 3-day run, and the paperwork was more extensive than usual. including multiple security clearances and non-disclosure agreements. I'd hauled classified military equipment before, so the bureaucracy didn't surprise me. But the pickup location did. Instead of a military base or defense contractor facility, I was directed to a remote warehouse complex in the Nevada desert, about 60 miles from any town. The facility looked like something from a science fiction movie. Concrete buildings with no windows, surrounded by high fences topped with razor wire and monitored by more security cameras than I'd ever seen in one place. The guards were professional but unfriendly, checking my credentials multiple times before allowing me past the perimeter. They directed me to a loading dock where my cargo was waiting, and when I saw it, I understood why the pay was so high. The container was massive, roughly the size of a small house, made of some kind of dark metal I didn't recognize. It had no markings, no identification numbers, no indication of what it contained or where it had come from. The surface was perfectly smooth, except for heavy-duty lifting points and what looked like ventilation grills near the top. Most importantly, it was incredibly heavy. My trailer is rated for 80,000 pounds, and this container was pushing that limit despite being hollow-sounding when the loading crew tapped on it with their tools. The loading process took nearly 6 hours, using specialized cranes and positioning equipment that I'd never seen before. The facility crew worked in complete silence, communicating through hand signals and earpiece radios that I couldn't hear. They were extraordinarily careful about weight distribution and securement, using chains and binders rated far beyond what the load should have required. When I asked about the cargo's destination and handling requirements, I was told simply to deliver it to a receiving facility in Pennsylvania and to maintain a steady speed with minimal stops. What struck me as odd during the loading was how the crew kept referring to monitoring equipment and telemetry systems. They attached several electronic devices to the container that looked like sophisticated sensors. And they gave me a tablet computer that displayed real-time data about the cargo. The screen showed weight distribution, internal temperature, and something labeled as movement sensors that I didn't understand. The lead technician told me to call immediately if any of the readings changed significantly during transport. I left Nevada around midnight, planning to drive straight through to Pennsylvania with only mandatory rest stops. The container rode smoothly despite its weight, and for the first few hundred miles, everything seemed normal. The sensor readings on the tablet remained steady, showing the cargo weight evenly distributed and all systems functioning normally. I started to relax, thinking this would be just another unusual but routine delivery. The first anomaly occurred somewhere in Colorado, about 8 hours into the trip. I was climbing through the Rockies when the weight distribution readings on the tablet suddenly shifted, showing the cargo mass moving toward the rear of the container. This should have been impossible. The container was sealed and supposedly contained fixed industrial equipment. But I could feel the change in my truck's handling immediately, like someone had moved several thousand pounds of cargo toward the back of the trailer. I pulled over at the next available spot and walked around my trailer, checking the securement and looking for any sign of what might have caused the shift. The container looked exactly the same as when I'd loaded it, with no visible damage or movement. The chains and binders were still tight, showing no signs that the container itself had shifted on the trailer. But according to the tablet, something inside had definitely moved, and I could feel the difference in how my truck handled when I got back on the road. Over the next few hours, the weight shifts became more frequent and more dramatic. Sometimes the mass would move to the front of the container, making my truck feel nose-heavy and difficult to steer. Other times, it would shift side to side, causing the trailer to sway in ways that had nothing to do with wind or road conditions. Each shift was accompanied by changes in the sensor readings that confirmed what I was feeling. Something large was moving around inside that sealed container, The movements weren't random either. They seemed to correspond to external conditions like changes in elevation, sharp curves, or variations in my speed. It was as if whatever was inside the container was responding to the motion of the truck, shifting its position in reaction to the forces of acceleration and deceleration. The more I thought about it, the more it reminded me of how a large animal might brace itself against the walls of a transport trailer to maintain its balance. By the time I reached Kansas, I was seriously considering calling the emergency number I'd been given to report problems with the cargo. The movements inside the container were becoming more violent and more frequent, sometimes occurring every few minutes. I could hear sounds now too, not mechanical noises like equipment coming loose, but something that sounded disturbingly organic. There were scraping sounds, like claws or talons dragging across metal, and occasional impacts that sounded like something large throwing itself against the walls of the container. What really frightened me was that the movements seemed to be getting stronger. The first few weight shifts had been subtle, maybe 1,000 pounds moving a few feet. But now I was seeing readings that indicated massive changes in weight distribution, as if something weighing several tons was moving back and forth inside the container with increasing violence. My truck was becoming difficult to control, especially on curves and hills where the shifting mass would amplify the natural movement of the trailer. I tried calling the emergency number around dawn on the second day, but got only a recording asking me to continue with the delivery unless there was immediate danger to public safety. The recording emphasized that the cargo was extremely valuable and time-sensitive, and that minor irregularities in the sensor readings were normal and expected. But what I was experiencing didn't feel minor, and it certainly didn't feel normal. The worst incident happened in Illinois, on a long downhill grade where I was using my engine brake to control speed. Something inside the container suddenly threw itself toward the front with tremendous force, causing such a dramatic weight shift that my truck's front wheels briefly left the ground. For a terrifying moment, I thought the entire rig was going to flip forward, crushing the cab with me inside it. I managed to regain control, but the experience left me shaking and convinced that whatever was in that container was actively trying to escape or cause an accident. I started avoiding hills and curves whenever possible, taking longer routes on flatter terrain to minimize the cargo's movement. But this strategy seemed to make whatever was inside more agitated. The impacts against the container walls became more frequent and more violent, and I started seeing stress fractures in the metal near the ventilation grills. The sounds were becoming more distinct too. I could swear I was hearing something that sounded like breathing or growling, though that should have been impossible to hear over the road noise and engine sound. The tablet computer started displaying error messages about sensor malfunctions, but I could tell from the way my truck was handling that the weight shifts were real and getting worse. Whatever was inside that container was becoming increasingly desperate to get out, and I was becoming increasingly desperate to get rid of it. I started driving faster than I normally would with a heavy load, wanting to reach the destination before something catastrophic happened. The delivery facility in Pennsylvania was even more secure than the pickup location, with military-style security and personnel who looked more like soldiers than warehouse workers. They seemed unsurprised by my reports of cargo movement and sensor anomalies, treating it as routine rather than the terrifying experience it had been for me. They unloaded the container quickly and efficiently, using the same specialized equipment and silent procedures I'd seen in Nevada. I never learned what was inside that container, and the non-disclosure agreement I signed ensures that I never will. But I know what I experienced during those 3 days on the road, and I know that it wasn't mechanical equipment or industrial machinery causing those movements. Something alive was inside that container, something large and intelligent enough to respond to the motion of the truck. something that was fighting desperately to escape from whatever prison it had been trapped in. I've hauled a lot of strange cargo over the years, but never anything that made me question my understanding of what's possible in this world. That container changed my perspective on what kinds of secrets might be transported across our highways, and what kinds of responsibilities we drivers might unknowingly bear when we agree to haul cargo without asking questions about what we're really carrying. I still take classified and unusual loads occasionally, but never again without insisting on at least basic information about the cargo's nature and handling requirements. The money isn't worth the nightmares that come with transporting something that might be better left wherever it came from, regardless of who's paying to move it or where they want it to go. My name is Zaire, and I've been running overnight automotive parts deliveries for 14 years, specializing in the routes that most drivers avoid. The late-night runs through remote areas where truck stops are sparse and help is hours away if something goes wrong. I prefer the solitude and the premium pay that comes with these difficult schedules, and I've always prided myself on being able to handle whatever the road throws at me. But what happened at an unmanned way station in New Mexico last August changed my perspective on just how vulnerable we are out there in the middle of nowhere, especially when the people who are supposed to help us aren't who they claim to be. I was hauling a load of transmission components from a manufacturing plant in Texas to an assembly facility in Arizona, a run I'd made at least 50 times before. The route takes you through some of the most desolate country in the Southwest, long stretches of desert highway where you might not see another vehicle for an hour at a time. It was a Tuesday night, around 3 in the morning, when I encountered the electronic message boards directing all commercial vehicles to report to an unmanned way station for a random DOT inspection. The signs were official-looking and properly placed, exactly like the ones you see for legitimate inspections. They directed trucks to exit at mile marker 247 on Interstate 40 and proceed to the way station for document review and equipment inspection. I'd been through dozens of these random checks before, so nothing seemed unusual about the instructions. The only thing that struck me as odd was the timing. Most DOT inspections happen during business hours when regular staff are available, not in the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere. The exit ramp led to a way station that looked legitimate at first glance. There were the usual scales, inspection bays, and a small office building that appeared to be standard DOT design. But as I pulled in and parked where the signs directed, I started noticing details that didn't feel right. The facility was lit, but not well. The lighting was uneven and created strange shadows that made it difficult to see clearly. There were no other trucks there, which was unusual for a random inspection that would typically catch several vehicles during the night hours. 2 men emerged from the office building as I shut down my engine, both wearing what appeared to be DOT inspection uniforms with proper badges and equipment. They looked professional enough, middle-aged, serious expressions, carrying clipboards, and the kind of handheld devices that inspectors use for electronic logging. One of them approached my driver's side door while the other walked around to examine my trailer. The one at my door asked for my license, registration, logbook, and bills of lading in the standard manner of a routine inspection. But as I handed over my documents, I started noticing things that made me increasingly uncomfortable. The inspector's uniform looked right from a distance, but up close the fabric seemed wrong, cheaper than what DOT personnel usually wear, and the badges looked slightly off, like good copies rather than official insignia. More importantly, his questions weren't following the normal inspection protocol. Instead of asking about my hours of service or load securement, he wanted to know about my route, my delivery schedule, and whether anyone was expecting me at specific times. The second inspector was taking an unusually long time examining my trailer, and I could see him through my mirrors doing things that had nothing to do with a standard DOT inspection. He was taking photographs of my cargo, writing down serial numbers from the boxes, and making phone calls on a cell phone rather than using the radio equipment that real inspectors carry. When I asked the first inspector about the unusual procedures, he became evasive and told me it was part of a new federal security initiative that I wouldn't be familiar with. That's when I noticed that my truck wouldn't start. When I turned the key, nothing happened. No engine turnover, no electrical response, nothing. The inspector claimed it was probably just a loose battery connection from the vibration of driving, and offered to help me check under the hood. But I'd been driving this truck for 3 years without any electrical problems, and it had been running perfectly fine when I'd shut it down 15 minutes earlier. The timing of the failure, combined with everything else that felt wrong about this situation, convinced me that someone had sabotaged my truck while I was being distracted by the inspection. I told the inspectors I needed to call my dispatch to report the delay. But when I pulled out my cell phone, I discovered I had no signal whatsoever. This was particularly strange because I'd had full bars when I'd been driving through this area earlier, and the way station was on high ground that should have had excellent reception. The inspector claimed that the facility's communication equipment sometimes interfered with cell phone signals. But that explanation didn't make sense given what I knew about how these systems work. The situation became truly frightening when I asked to use the radio in the office to call for roadside assistance. The inspector reluctantly agreed, but when we walked toward the building, I could see through the windows that it was essentially empty inside. There was no dispatch equipment, no computers, no signs of the operational infrastructure that every real way station has. Instead, there were just a couple of folding tables with some papers scattered on them, and what looked like camping equipment in one corner. That's when I realized I was in serious trouble. These weren't DOT inspectors. They were criminals who had set up a fake inspection operation to target trucks carrying valuable cargo in remote locations. My load of transmission components was worth over $200,000, exactly the kind of high-value automotive parts that are frequently stolen and resold through black market networks. They'd chosen this location because it was isolated, had disabled my truck to prevent me from leaving, and were probably planning to steal my cargo and leave me stranded in the desert. I tried to appear calm while my mind raced through possible escape options. The fake inspectors were both armed. I could see handguns in holsters under their jackets, and they were clearly experienced at this kind of operation. The way station setup was too elaborate and realistic to have been improvised. They'd been planning this for a long time and had probably used the same method to rob other drivers. I was alone, miles from help, with no way to communicate and no way to escape in my truck. My salvation came from an unexpected source. A real Colorado State Patrol trooper happened to be driving through the area on his way to an emergency call and noticed the unusual activity at the way station. He told me later that something about the scene had looked wrong to him. Way stations in that area weren't supposed to be conducting nighttime operations, and the vehicles he could see didn't match the official DOT fleet he was familiar with. The trooper radioed for backup before approaching the facility, which probably saved my life. When he pulled into the way station and identified himself, the fake inspectors immediately knew their operation was blown. One of them ran for a vehicle parked behind the office building, while the other tried to convince the trooper that they were conducting legitimate federal business. But the trooper had already confirmed through dispatch that no DOT inspections were scheduled for that location. And the whole situation unraveled quickly. The arrest that followed revealed a sophisticated cargo theft operation that had been targeting trucks for months. The criminals had identified way stations that were typically unmanned during night hours, set up fake inspection checkpoints, and used official-looking equipment and uniforms to stop valuable loads. They would disable trucks by disconnecting battery cables or pulling fuses, then steal cargo while the drivers were stranded and unable to call for help. The investigation showed that they'd successfully robbed at least 6 other trucks using similar methods, stealing everything from electronics to pharmaceuticals to the automotive parts they'd been after in my case. They'd chosen victims carefully, targeting drivers who were traveling alone on remote routes during hours when legitimate help would be far away. The fake way station was just one of several setups they'd established across the Southwest. What made this operation particularly dangerous was how realistic their deception was. They'd obtained authentic-looking DOT uniforms, proper inspection equipment, and even official forms and documentation. The average driver would have had no reason to suspect that the inspection wasn't legitimate until it was too late to escape. If that trooper hadn't happened to drive by when he did, I would have lost my cargo and possibly my life in that remote desert location. The experience taught me to be much more suspicious of unusual inspection procedures, especially during off hours in isolated locations. I now verify any unexpected inspections by calling dispatch or local law enforcement before complying with unusual instructions. I also carry backup communication equipment and have developed emergency protocols for situations where my truck is disabled in remote areas. Most importantly, I learned that criminals are constantly developing new methods to exploit the trust and compliance that keeps the trucking industry functioning. We drivers are taught to cooperate with law enforcement and regulatory inspections. But that same compliance makes us vulnerable to people who abuse our trust for criminal purposes. The balance between following proper procedures and protecting ourselves from predators is something every driver needs to think about, especially those of us who work the remote routes where help is far away, and predators know they can operate with impunity. That fake way station in New Mexico was a wake-up call about just how vulnerable we are out there and how important it is to trust our instincts when something doesn't feel right, even when it looks official. My name is Victoria, and I've been running regional routes through the Pacific Northwest for 4 years now. Mostly lumber and paper products from the mills to distribution centers throughout Oregon and Washington. The mountainous terrain and dense forests of this region can be challenging, especially during winter months when weather conditions change rapidly and cell phone coverage becomes spotty. That's why most of us keep our CB radios tuned to emergency channels when we're driving through the more remote areas. Sometimes, it's the only way to call for help or respond to other drivers in trouble. But what started as a routine emergency response on a logging road outside Eugene last October turned into the most psychologically disturbing experience of my career. One that still makes me question whether I was helping save a life or being deliberately led into a trap. It was a Thursday evening in late October, and I was hauling a load of finished lumber from a mill in Eugene to a construction supply company in Portland. I'd finished loading later than planned and was running about 2 hours behind schedule, which meant I'd be driving through the Cascade foothills in complete darkness. The weather was typical for that time of year. Light rain, temperature in the 40s, with patches of fog in the valleys that made visibility challenging. I was taking Highway 126 east toward I-5, a route I'd driven dozens of times when I heard the distress call on CB Channel 9. The voice belonged to a man who sounded middle-aged and genuinely panicked. He was calling Mayday repeatedly, saying his truck had gone off the road and that he was injured and trapped in his cab. He gave his location as Forest Service Road 19, about 8 miles off Highway 126, and said he'd been there for over an hour without seeing any other traffic. The desperation in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't someone playing games or trying to get attention. This was a driver in real trouble who needed immediate help. I responded immediately, telling him I was about 15 minutes from his location and would be there as soon as possible. He thanked me with obvious relief and asked me to hurry, saying he thought he might have internal injuries and was having trouble staying conscious. I called 911 on my cell phone to report the accident, but I was in an area with no coverage, so I couldn't get through to emergency services. The CB was my only means of communication, and this driver's only hope for rescue. Following the directions he gave me, I turned off Highway 126 onto Forest Service Road 19, a narrow gravel road that wound through dense timber country. The road was in poor condition, full of potholes and washouts that forced me to drive much slower than I normally would. The injured driver continued talking to me on the CB, giving me updates on his condition and providing more specific directions to his location. He said his truck had gone off the road during a turn, that he was about 50 feet down an embankment, and that his headlights were still working so I should be able to spot him. As I drove deeper into the forest, the road conditions got worse and the directions became more complex. The driver was guiding me through a series of turns onto progressively smaller logging roads, each one more remote and difficult to navigate than the last. He seemed to know the area extremely well, referencing landmarks like old logging equipment, abandoned cabins, and specific road markers that I could see exactly as he described them. But with each turn, I was getting farther from any possibility of cell phone coverage or outside help. After about 30 minutes of driving through increasingly challenging terrain, I started to question whether I was going the right direction. I should have reached the accident scene by now, but I hadn't seen any sign of a truck or anyone in distress. When I keyed up the CB to ask for clarification on my location, the driver's response was immediate and specific. He could see my headlights coming, and I was almost there, just one more turn to the left, past a large fallen tree. But when I made that turn, there was no accident scene. No truck, no headlights, no sign of anyone in distress. Just more empty logging road disappearing into the darkness ahead of me. I stopped and called out on the CB, asking the driver to turn on his hazard lights or blow his horn so I could locate him. His response chilled me to the bone. He said he could see me clearly now, that I was parked right next to his location, and he was confused about why I couldn't see him. That's when I realized something was fundamentally wrong with this entire situation. I was alone on a remote logging road, miles from any main highway, with no cell phone coverage and no way to verify that the emergency I was responding to was real. The voice on the CB continued talking to me, becoming more urgent and insistent, telling me I needed to get out of my truck and look for him in the woods. He said he'd crawled away from his truck after the accident and was lying behind some fallen logs where I couldn't see him from the road. Every instinct I had was screaming that this was a setup, that someone was using a fake emergency to lure me into a remote location for reasons I didn't want to think about. But the voice on the CB sounded so genuinely distressed, so desperate for help, that I couldn't completely dismiss the possibility that there really was someone out there who needed rescue. The psychological pressure was enormous. If I was wrong and drove away, I might be leaving an injured person to die alone in the woods. I decided to compromise by staying in my truck but driving slowly along the road, searching with my headlights and spotlight for any sign of an accident or injured person. The voice on the CB continued guiding me, always saying the victim was just a little farther ahead, just around the next curve, just past the next group of trees. But I never found anything. And gradually, I began to notice that the voice was becoming less concerned with being rescued and more concerned with getting me to leave my truck. The breaking point came when the voice started providing information that he couldn't possibly know. He began describing my truck in detail, the color, the company logos, even specific equipment I had mounted on my cab. He knew I was hauling lumber and seemed to know exactly what route I'd been taking before I responded to his emergency call. Most disturbing of all, he started using my name, even though I'd never given it to him during our CB conversations. That's when I knew for certain that I was dealing with someone who had been watching me, someone who had planned this fake emergency specifically to get me alone in this remote location. I fired up my engine and started driving back toward the main highway as fast as the rough roads would allow. But the voice on the CB became increasingly agitated and threatening. He dropped all pretense of being injured and started demanding that I come back, using language that made it clear his intentions toward me were violent. The most terrifying part of my escape was that he seemed to know exactly where I was, even though I couldn't see him. As I drove back through the maze of logging roads, he provided a running commentary on my location, describing turns I was making and landmarks I was passing. It was as if he was following me somehow, tracking my movements through the forest in a way that I couldn't detect or understand. I finally reached Highway 126 after what felt like hours of driving through those dark woods. And I'd never been so relieved to see pavement and traffic lights in my life. I immediately called 911 to report what had happened. And the Oregon State Police took my statement seriously enough to send a patrol car to meet me. The trooper who responded was familiar with similar incidents in that area. Apparently, fake emergency calls had been used to lure drivers, hunters, and other travelers into remote locations where they were robbed or worse. The investigation that followed revealed that I'd been targeted by someone who had been monitoring CB traffic and using fake distress calls to lure victims into the forest. The perpetrator knew the logging road system extremely well and had probably been using this method for months or even years. The state police found evidence of other incidents where drivers had responded to similar fake emergencies, though most of them had been smart enough to turn back before getting as deep into the woods as I had. What still haunts me about the experience is how convincing the fake emergency was, and how difficult it was to distinguish between a genuine call for help and a carefully planned trap. The voice had sounded so authentically distressed, so genuinely desperate, that every humanitarian instinct I had was telling me to help. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated and effective, exploiting the natural desire of most drivers to help their fellow travelers in distress. I still respond to emergency calls on the CB, but now I verify them through multiple sources before putting myself at risk. I carry better communication equipment so I can contact authorities even in remote areas, and I never leave main highways to respond to emergencies unless I have backup from law enforcement. The experience taught me that predators are constantly developing new methods to exploit our better instincts, and that sometimes the most dangerous traps are the ones that appeal to our desire to help others. The CB emergency that never ended was a reminder that not everyone on the airwaves has good intentions, and that we need to balance our willingness to help with our responsibility to protect ourselves from those who would exploit our compassion for their own evil purposes. My name is Reed, and I've been running cross-country furniture moving for 17 years, specializing in high-end residential relocations that take me from coast to coast on a regular basis. When you spend that much time on the road, you develop very specific routines and habits that help you stay alert and aware of your surroundings. I know every mile marker on the major interstates. I can predict traffic patterns in cities I've never lived in, and I'm acutely aware of the vehicles around me at all times. That's why what started happening to me 6 months ago was so deeply unsettling. Because according to every logical explanation, what I was seeing in my mirrors should have been impossible. It began during a run from a mansion in Connecticut to a new home in Malibu, California, hauling a load of antique furniture and artwork worth close to $500,000. I was taking I-80 west through Pennsylvania when I first noticed the truck in my mirrors. It was an older Peterbilt 379, probably from the early 1990s, painted in a distinctive deep blue color with chrome details that caught the sunlight. The truck was pulling what appeared to be a standard dry van trailer. Nothing unusual about the setup except for how well-maintained it looked for a rig that had to be at least 30 years old. What caught my attention initially wasn't the truck itself, but the way it was maintaining position behind me. It stayed exactly 3/4 of a mile back, never getting closer, never falling farther behind, regardless of how my speed varied with traffic conditions or terrain changes. When I slowed down for construction zones, the blue Peterbilt slowed down proportionally. When traffic opened up and I could increase speed, it matched my acceleration perfectly. Over the course of several hours, it became clear that this wasn't coincidence. The driver was deliberately maintaining that specific distance behind me. I tried various tests to confirm what I was seeing. I would suddenly slow down by 10 miles per hour, and the blue truck would slow down accordingly. I would change lanes multiple times, and it would change lanes to stay directly behind me. I would take exit ramps to fuel stops, and when I looked back at the highway from the truck stop, I could see the blue Peterbilt pulled over on the shoulder, apparently waiting for me to return to the road. It was like having a shadow that maintained perfect distance no matter what I did. At first, I assumed it was another driver who happened to be going the same direction and found it easier to follow my lead rather than navigate independently. It's not uncommon for drivers to informally convoy together on long runs, especially through unfamiliar territory or challenging weather conditions. But this was different. The following was too precise, too consistent. And the driver never attempted to communicate with me via CB radio or by flashing lights, which is normal protocol when drivers are traveling together. By the time I reached Illinois, I was becoming genuinely concerned about being followed. The blue Peterbilt had been behind me for over 8 hours, through multiple states and hundreds of miles of varying road conditions. I tried calling out on CB Channel 19, asking if the driver of the blue Pete wanted to make contact, but got no response. I tried switching to other channels, thinking maybe the driver was monitoring a different frequency, but still got no acknowledgement that anyone was receiving my transmissions. The situation became truly bizarre when I stopped for my mandatory rest break at a truck stop outside Des Moines, Iowa. I parked in a well-lit area where I could keep an eye on the entrance and waited to see if the blue Peterbilt would follow me off the highway. Sure enough, it appeared at the truck stop entrance about 10 minutes after I'd parked. But instead of pulling into the parking area like a normal driver would, it drove slowly through the lot and then disappeared behind the building. I walked around the entire truck stop looking for that blue Peterbilt, but it was nowhere to be found. The truck stop wasn't that large, and there were only a limited number of places a big rig could park. But somehow, that distinctive blue truck had vanished completely. I asked other drivers if they'd seen it, described the color and model, but nobody had noticed the truck I was talking about. One driver suggested that maybe I'd been staring at my mirrors too long and was seeing things that weren't there, which made me question my own perceptions. But when I got back on the road after my break, there it was again in my mirrors, maintaining that same 3/4 mile distance, following my exact route as if nothing had happened. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. But the truck was definitely there, definitely real, and definitely following me with a precision that went far beyond normal driving behavior. The pattern continued across Nebraska, Colorado, and Utah. Every time I stopped, the blue Peterbilt would disappear, and every time I resumed driving, it would reappear in my mirrors at exactly the same distance. I started taking photographs with my phone, trying to document what I was seeing. But every picture of my mirrors came out blurry or distorted, as if the camera couldn't properly focus on the truck. Even more strange, when I showed the photos to other people, they claimed they couldn't see any truck in the images at all. The most unsettling incident occurred when I was climbing through the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. The grade was steep and winding, the kind of terrain where maintaining consistent speeds is nearly impossible due to varying engine loads and braking requirements. But somehow, that blue Peterbilt maintained its exact position behind me throughout the entire climb, matching every speed variation with impossible precision. It was driving like it knew exactly what I was going to do before I did it. As I crested the mountains and began the descent toward the Central Valley, I decided to conduct one final test. I pulled into a scenic overlook that provided a clear view of several miles of highway behind me, planning to use binoculars to get a better look at the truck and hopefully identify the driver. I could see the blue Peterbilt approaching the overlook in my mirrors as I pulled off the highway. But when I positioned myself at the viewing area and looked back at the road with my binoculars, there was nothing there. The highway was completely empty in both directions, no traffic at all visible for miles. But when I returned to my truck and checked my mirrors, the blue Peterbilt was sitting on the shoulder of the highway below, apparently waiting for me to resume my journey. I could see it clearly in my mirrors, could make out details like the chrome exhaust stacks and the specific design of the grille. But when I looked directly at the highway with my eyes or through binoculars, there was nothing there at all. That's when I realized I might be dealing with something that couldn't be explained by normal logic. The blue Peterbilt existed only in my mirrors, only as a reflection that somehow didn't correspond to any physical object on the road behind me. It was following me in a way that defied the laws of physics, maintaining a presence that was real enough for me to see consistently, but somehow invisible to direct observation or photographic documentation. I completed my delivery in Malibu, while the phantom truck continued its relentless following, maintaining its position even through the complex navigation required to reach the residential neighborhood where I was unloading. The blue Peterbilt appeared in my mirrors throughout the entire delivery process, sitting patiently while I spent hours carefully moving antique furniture into the new home. It was there when I finished the delivery, there when I dead-headed to a truck stop to find my next load, and there when I began the return journey toward the East Coast. The phantom following continued for weeks, through multiple loads and thousands of miles of driving. The blue Peterbilt became a constant presence in my mirrors, so consistent that I started to feel uncomfortable when I couldn't see it. It became part of my driving routine, checking my mirrors not just for traffic and safety, but to confirm that my phantom companion was still maintaining its vigil behind me. I researched the phenomenon online, looking for other drivers who might have experienced similar situations, and found scattered reports of phantom vehicles that appeared in mirrors but couldn't be observed directly. Some drivers theorized that these were the spirits of deceased truckers who continued to travel the highways they'd driven in life. Others suggested more scientific explanations involving optical illusions or psychological phenomena related to the stress and isolation of long-distance driving. The explanation that made the most sense to me came from an old-timer I met at a truck stop in Kansas. A driver with over 40 years of experience who'd heard similar stories throughout his career. He suggested that some trucks, especially those driven by drivers who'd spent their entire lives on the road, left behind a kind of imprint on the highways they'd traveled. These phantom trucks would attach themselves to active drivers, continuing their endless journeys as reflections in mirrors and shadows on the road. According to this theory, my phantom follower was the spirit or memory of a driver who died while driving that blue Peterbilt. Someone who'd been so devoted to the road that death couldn't stop him from continuing his runs. The truck was following me because I represented a connection to the life he'd lost. a way to continue participating in the trucking community that had been his entire world. Whether that explanation is true or not, I've come to accept the phantom truck as a permanent part of my driving experience. It's been following me for 6 months now, through dozens of loads and tens of thousands of miles. I've stopped trying to photograph it or prove its existence to others, and I've stopped being frightened by its presence. In fact, I've started to find it comforting, like having a guardian angel watching over me from the mirrors. The blue Peterbilt is there every time I check my mirrors, maintaining its perfect distance, following my exact route with supernatural precision. It never gets tired, never needs fuel, never stops for rest breaks. It's the most dedicated driving partner I've ever had, even though we've never spoken and never will. Some nights, when the road gets lonely and the miles stretch endlessly ahead, I'm grateful for the company, even if it comes from beyond the grave. I've learned that the road has its own mysteries, its own spirits, and its own ways of taking care of the drivers who dedicate their lives to it. The phantom truck in my mirrors is just one of those mysteries, one that I've stopped trying to understand and started learning to appreciate. After all, in a profession where we spend most of our time alone, having a loyal companion who never leaves your side isn't such a bad thing. Even if that companion exists only in the reflection of your mirrors. My name is Brian Thompson, but everyone in the trucking community has called me Diesel for the past 31 years. I started driving when I was 22 years old, fresh out of the Army and looking for a career that would let me see the country while making a decent living. Over 3 decades, I've hauled everything from produce to petroleum, driven every major highway in America multiple times, and seen just about everything the road has to offer. I was planning to retire next month, ready to hang up my keys and settle down with my wife in the house we bought outside Phoenix. But 6 months ago, something happened at mile marker 237 on Interstate 10 in West Texas that changed everything I thought I knew about the highways I've traveled for most of my adult life. I've driven that particular stretch of I-10 hundreds of times over the years. It's a desolate piece of road between Fort Stockton and El Paso, running through some of the emptiest country you'll find anywhere in America. Mile marker 237 sits in the middle of absolute nowhere. No towns, no rest areas, no services for 50 miles in either direction. It's the kind of place where your CB radio goes silent, your GPS signal gets weak, and you feel completely isolated from the rest of the world. Most drivers just put their head down and push through as quickly as possible. But I'd always found something peaceful about that loneliness, something that reminded me why I fell in love with trucking in the first place. The incident happened on a Tuesday night in March, around 11:30. I was running a load of construction equipment from Houston to Phoenix, making good time on mostly empty highways. The weather was clear, no wind to speak of, perfect driving conditions for that time of year. I was listening to a talk radio station out of San Antonio, half paying attention to some late-night discussion about UFO sightings in the Southwest, when my radio suddenly cut to static as I approached mile marker 237. Static on the radio wasn't unusual in that area. The terrain and distance from broadcasting stations meant that signals could be unpredictable. But what was unusual was that my CB radio went silent at exactly the same time, not even picking up the background chatter and skip that you normally hear even in remote areas. More concerning was that my GPS display went blank, showing the "searching for satellites" message that I'd only seen a few times before, in the most isolated mountain passes. I slowed down instinctively, not sure why, but feeling like something was wrong with the situation. That's when I noticed that my truck's electrical systems were acting strangely. My dashboard lights were dimming and brightening rhythmically. My air conditioning compressor was cycling on and off randomly. And my engine was running rough despite having been perfectly smooth just moments before. It was like something was interfering with all the electronic systems in my truck simultaneously. As I passed mile marker 237, I saw something that I still can't adequately describe or explain. About a quarter mile off the highway to the south, there was a light source that was brighter than anything I'd ever seen, but somehow didn't illuminate the surrounding desert. It wasn't like a spotlight or searchlight. Those create visible beams and light up everything around them. This was more like a concentrated ball of intense white light hanging about 50 feet above the ground. Perfectly stationary and silent. The light was so bright that I had to squint to look at it. But it wasn't casting shadows or lighting up the cacti and scrub brush beneath it. It was as if the light existed independently of the physical world around it, interacting with my eyes, but not with anything else. I'd seen plenty of aircraft lights during my years of night driving, but this was different. Too bright, too stationary, and located in an area where no aircraft should have been operating. I pulled over to get a better look, parking on the shoulder and shutting down my engine. The moment my truck stopped running, all the electrical problems disappeared. My radio came back on. My GPS reacquired its signal, and my dashboard returned to normal. But the strange light remained, hanging motionless in the desert night like a miniature sun that had forgotten how to shine properly. I got out of my cab and walked around to the passenger side of my truck to get an unobstructed view of the phenomenon. Standing there in the complete silence of the desert, I could feel something that I can only describe as a presence, like I was being watched or studied by something invisible. The air itself felt different, thicker, more electrically charged, like the atmosphere just before a major thunderstorm hits. The light began to move, not quickly, but with deliberate purpose, following a pattern that seemed almost like a search grid. It would hover over one area for 30 seconds or so, then move to an adjacent location and repeat the process. As it moved, I could see that it was illuminating the ground directly beneath it. But the illumination was contained in a perfect circle that didn't spill over into the surrounding area. What truly frightened me was the realization that the light was moving in my direction, systematically covering the desert between its starting position and the highway where I was standing. Whatever was controlling that light was conducting a methodical search, and I was directly in its path. Every instinct I'd developed in 31 years of driving was telling me to get back in my truck and get away from there as fast as possible. But I was also transfixed by what I was witnessing. In 3 decades of driving, mostly at night, mostly through remote areas, I'd seen meteors, ball lightning, military aircraft, and every other natural or man-made phenomenon you could imagine. This was something entirely different, something that didn't fit into any category of experience I could reference. It was clearly under intelligent control, but operating according to principles that I didn't understand. The light continued its systematic approach, and I could see that it would reach the highway in another few minutes. I made the decision to leave, but when I tried to start my truck, nothing happened. The engine wouldn't turn over, the electrical system was completely dead, and even my emergency flashers wouldn't operate. I was stranded at mile marker 237 with whatever was controlling that light bearing down on my position. I tried my cell phone, but the screen showed no signal and wouldn't even power on properly. I tried the emergency radio in my truck, but it was as dead as everything else. I was completely cut off from any form of communication or assistance. alone in the desert with something approaching that defied every rational explanation I could conceive. The light reached the highway about 50 yards from where my truck was parked. Up close, it was even more intense and unsettling than it had appeared from a distance. I could see that it wasn't actually a single light source, but rather a collection of smaller lights arranged in a pattern that my eyes couldn't quite process. The pattern seemed to shift and change as I looked at it, like an optical illusion that wouldn't hold still long enough for my brain to understand what it was seeing. Then the light stopped moving and simply hovered over the highway, apparently focused on my truck and me. I felt exposed and vulnerable, like a specimen under a microscope being examined by something vastly more intelligent than myself. The sensation of being studied was overwhelming, accompanied by a strange tingling sensation that started in my fingertips and gradually spread through my entire body. I don't know how long this examination lasted. My watch had stopped working along with everything else electronic. But it felt like an eternity. The light remained perfectly stationary while I stood there, unable to move, unable to think clearly, unable to do anything except experience whatever was happening to me. I was conscious and aware, but somehow not in control of my own actions or reactions. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the encounter ended. The light moved away from the highway, returning to its original position in the desert, then shot straight upward at impossible speed and disappeared completely. The moment it vanished, all my truck's systems came back online, my watch resumed ticking, and my cell phone showed normal signal strength. I got back in my truck and continued driving toward Phoenix. But I was profoundly shaken by what had happened. I couldn't explain it to myself, couldn't fit it into any framework of understanding that made sense. For the remaining 200 miles to my destination, I kept checking my mirrors and scanning the sky, expecting to see that light again. But the night remained normal and uneventful. When I reached Phoenix, I tried to research what I'd experienced, looking online for similar reports from other drivers or residents of the area. I found scattered accounts of unusual lights and electronic interference along that stretch of I-10, but nothing that exactly matched what I'd witnessed. Most of the reports were dismissed as natural phenomena or military testing, explanations that didn't satisfy me given what I'd experienced firsthand. I completed that load and returned to Texas, but I deliberately took a different route that avoided mile marker 237. I've been avoiding that section of highway ever since, taking longer routes that add hours to my trips rather than risk another encounter. I know how that sounds coming from a driver with over 3 million safe miles. But something happened to me out there that I'm not ready to experience again. The incident has haunted me for 6 months now, affecting my sleep, my concentration, and my overall enjoyment of driving. I find myself constantly watching the sky, constantly checking my electronic systems for signs of interference, constantly wondering if what I experienced was unique, or if there are other drivers out there who've had similar encounters but are afraid to talk about them. That's why I've decided to tell this story now, as my final account before retirement. I've spent my entire adult life on America's highways, and I've always believed that I understood the road and its challenges. But mile marker 237 taught me that there are mysteries out there that go far beyond anything I thought possible. Mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about our world and our place in it. I don't know what I encountered that night in West Texas, and I may never know. But I know it was real. I know it was intelligent, and I know it was interested in me for reasons I can't begin to understand. That knowledge has changed me in ways that make it impossible to continue driving with the same confidence and peace of mind I once had. So I'm hanging up my keys and staying close to home, leaving the highways to younger drivers who haven't yet learned to fear what might be waiting for them at mile marker 237 or places like it. The road has been good to me for 31 years, but some experiences are too overwhelming to survive more than once. Let someone else find out what's really out there in the darkness beyond our headlights. If these stories have kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure you're subscribed to Verified Fears for more terrifying true encounters from the darkest corners of reality. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest spine-chilling content. And let us know in the comments which story disturbed you the most. The road holds more secrets than most people realize, and we're here to share them all.